We had a cycle of presentations by Marianne Everly from the Classics Department. And today we're going to have the last lecture in this series. And we've got two faculty members from the Classics Department that I'll introduce shortly to wrap it up. One of them is going to be starting by talking a bit about creation myths in Greek mythology, and then the other one you will see will be picking up with Norse mythology. So I don't want someone to think that this is going to be only Greek mythology, because that's not what the title says. So we'll be seeing a bit of both. So we have with us today Jennifer Rea, who holds a PhD in classics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At UF, she is a professor of classics and chair of the department. Her research focuses on Augustan age Rome, classical reception studies, and early Christian literature. And among other things, she also explores the intersection between the ancient Rome and modern science fiction and fantasy. She is the author of a number of books and articles for which she has been the recipient of a number of awards. Her love of classics began when she visited the Colosseum in Rome at age 5, and her father took her to see the real live wolf that used to be on display on the Capitoline Hill. Sort of reminds me of the alligator that used to be on the campus. So that's how she began, how her love of the classics began. Her most popular undergraduate courses include classics and science fiction, heroes, gods, and monsters, and that'll sound like a familiar title, and Rome, the Eternal City. So that's Jennifer Rea. And we also have Avery Cahill. And Avery, I must say, has one of the most interesting resumes I've ever seen. He has a BS from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's from the same university in Scandinavian languages, literatures, and linguistics. And I think it also mentions on LinkedIn that he knows a great deal about math and physics. He studied Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Old Norse, and Latin, and also lived abroad in Norway. He has taught Norwegian and published and presented papers on science fiction in Scandinavia, and also worked as a translator. At UF, he has taught Latin at all levels and honors courses in the Icelandic sagas. He's a poet and a horror writer whose work has appeared in the Dog Oil Press, Innsmouth Free Press, and Future Lovecraft. And so that's Avery. And so we're now going to hear from them. I think Jennifer's going to talk a bit about the creation myths in Greek mythology, and then Avery's going to pick it up and talk about Norse mythology. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Sheila Dickinson for the kind invitation to speak here. I'm delighted to be here, and so is Avery, and I hope that we have a fun afternoon talking about creation myths.
We do have this too. Do you prefer to hold it?
I think holding is fine. So Myths of Zeus. Okay, thanks. Oh, great. Okay. So I want to start by talking about the ancient Greek story written by the author Hesiod. It is our most significant source of Greek cosmogony and the first known Greek cosmogony. And a cosmogony is a work that explains the world's origin. Hesiod describes how the universe was created and then goes on to explain how it changes as the generation of gods appear. Since he talks about the creation of the gods, his work is also a theogony, which is something that explains the gods' origin and their rise to power, and that is in fact what he calls his work, the theogony. So according to Hesiod, the muses gave him the power to sing this song. They were his inspiration, they entered his head, and out came the words. And first to appear was Chaos, followed by Gaia, or Mother Earth, as we would know her. Tartarus, or the underside of the earth, follows, and then finally love or eros, really attraction or sexual love. And keep in mind that Hesiod doesn't tell us where chaos comes from, just simply that chaos came first. And that what you have to think of is you understand chaos as the gap that appears out of which all the other gods come. As you can see from this chart, the early gods were often personified forces of nature. They will not play a major role in the study of myth, but it is from these generations that the later gods come. Gaia, or Mother Earth, is beneath the sky, and Uranos is the heavens, and Tartarus is beneath the earth. So Gaia first gives birth to Uranos, or the sky god, and she and her son create 3 more sets of children: the Titans, the Cyclopses, and the Hecatoncheires. And the Titans consist of 6 males and 6 females. They don't play a large role in later myth, but one of the Titans, Cronus, will have an important role. And he and his Titan sister Rhea will actually be the parents or grandparents of the 12 Olympians. The 3 Cyclopses are kind of monstrous. They have only one eye, and they're very strong and capable of building weapons, including making lightning. But they don't play a major role in Greek myth either. So what we're seeing right now are the early generations who really just sort of set the backdrop for the more familiar gods you might have heard of, like Zeus and Hera. And then the 3 Hecatoncheires have 100 arms and 50 heads, and they have unbeatable strength, but also don't play a major role in Greek myth. So we're in the very, very early creation phase right here, without a lot of backstory as to how the gods came to be. So the Titan Hyperion fathered Selene, or the moon, and Eos, or dawn, and Hyperion was a sun god whose son, also a sun god, was named Helios. And one of the most famous stories about Helios is that he fathered a son with Clymene, and that son, Phaeton, was being raised by his mother and stepfather, the king of Ethiopia. And his mother told him one day that his father was really the sun god. And he wanted to meet his father because he wanted to prove to the other kids on the playground who taunted him that he really had a god as his father. So the sun god granted him one wish, just one wish only. And Phaeton asked for something that his father did not want to give him because it was a dangerous request. Every day in the stories of Greek myth, Helios would drive the chariot of the sun across the sky, creating day. And of course, his sister Selene Moon would drive it at night. But this is a dangerous, dangerous task. It's like a child asking for the keys to your car. So Helios begs his son not to drive the chariot because it would be so dangerous for someone with no experience to guide the horses. But he cannot go back on his promise. And this is common in myth. You know, once something's set, you can't go back on it, and you have to simply endure the consequences. So he must watch in horror as his son nearly sets the world on fire until Zeus, the king of the gods, takes pity on him and his son Phaeton and sends a lightning bolt out of the sky to blast Phaeton out of the chariot, and Phaeton falls to the earth and dies. But one of the most famous stories in Greek myth is the story of Cronus, and how he's the Titan I spoke of earlier, and how he castrates his father, Uranos. The story serves to explain the separation of sky from earth. When Uranos' children are born, he hides them away under the earth, and then Gaia, the children's mother, asks her children to help her free them, and only Cronus accepts the challenge. Gaia hides him with a weapon, and he castrates his father. Now sky and earth are finally separated at last. But the drops of blood from the castration create the Furies, which are goddesses who seek out people who kill their own relatives and make them go mad. And the other drops of blood create the Giants, who will attack a later generation of gods. So out of this violent act will come more violence. And that's another good lesson in myth, and especially follows with creation stories. But as soon as sky and earth are separate, we learn that Tartarus, or the underworld, is attached to Gaia, and that Oceanus, or the flowy water, is all around the land. So as soon as the separation happens, you then get the underworld and the water, and now the world has been formed. Now, when Uranos was castrated, his blood fell on the earth, but his genitals were carried out to sea. And out of the sea foam rose a beautiful goddess, Aphrodite. She's the goddess of love. But you might ask, how out of this horrible god love was created? Well, Aphrodite is the goddess of sexual desire, and if you think about it, in many myths, sexual desire can also be very destructive. So it has its good points and its bad points. We learn that the children of Gaia were created by her in Pontus, or the sea. Often, these children were considered monstrous in that they could change shape. And as I have on the slide here, a monster comes from the word monstro, that which you point at in surprise. And if you think about it, monsters often challenge us to think about what makes us human or what societal boundaries we push against or pull back from. What is forbidden and why in a culture? So a lot of these myths tell you about boundaries that people try and cross and the punishment that they'll endure. In Greek myth, monsters often have a mixture of human and animal parts. Take the Sphinx, for example, who has the head of a woman and the body of a lion and wings, and is also known as the Strangler. Now that the world has been created, Cronus is the first king. He learns that he will be overthrown by someone smarter, so he plots to make sure that this can never happen. He swallows his children to prevent any of the smart ones from taking over his kingdom. His wife, Rhea, who also happens to be his sister, asks her parents, Gaia and Uranos, for advice. And they tell her to go to the city of Crete to have her youngest child, Zeus. There, he will be kept safe. In place of her last child, Rhea gives Cronus a stone to swallow. And in the next part of the story, Zeus makes Cronos vomit up his siblings. Zeus becomes king of the gods, and one day he and his siblings, who make up 6 of the 12 Olympians, will divide up the world. So I wanted to explain something. This comes up a lot in popular media where you'll see television shows confusing the gods. So I want to explain to you that when you study ancient myth, you'll hear all about the Roman god of the harvest, Saturn, who's often equated with Cronus. And the story about Cronus is sometimes told as Saturn devouring his children. And you will also hear about the god of time, Kronos, who is equated sometimes with Cronus because the story of Cronus eating his children can symbolize time devouring all things. So it's kind of a lesson about how time destroys or devours all. Now, our story of Zeus doesn't end with the overthrow of his father. He becomes king of the gods, and he may be one of the Greek gods that you're most familiar with. But the Titans, who are kind of monstrous, resent his rule, and they attack him and his siblings, and in a battle known as the Titanomachy. And Zeus learns that he can only win the fight if he allows the Hecatoncheires with 100 arms and 50 heads to fight alongside him. So he releases them from Tartarus, where he's imprisoned them because they're so monstrous, along with the Cyclopes, and the battle begins. The Cyclopes are grateful for the release and create a thunderbolt for Zeus to use as a weapon. So that's the story of how Zeus gets his thunderbolt that he can use. But after Zeus wins the battle, he imprisons all the Titans in Tartarus except for Atlas, who must hold up the sky to ensure that sky and earth remain separated. And there you have a picture of Atlas with the great hero Hercules, in fact. So in continuing the creation story, you can see each of these, at the end of each of these battles, we find out something new about the world. How does the world held up? Well, Atlas after the battle of the Titans. So here, Zeus's next battle is with the monster Typhon. His grandmother Gaia resents the victory against the Titans and gives birth to this giant monster who attacks Zeus. When Zeus finally defeats the monster, he buries him in Sicily under Mount Etna. And it's after this battle that Zeus swallows Metis, whose name means cleverness. He gets a terrible headache, and out of his head springs Athena, the goddess of wisdom, fully grown. You will notice that when the Greek gods reproduce, it's by very unusual means. We've had Zeus's daughter spring from her father's head, the goddess of love comes from the foam in the sea, and monsters arise from drops of blood. Zeus's final battle is with the giants. So remember, they were created by Gaia from the blood of Uranos. The giants attack the Olympians and are joined by the great hero Hercules. I'm sorry, there we go. For they cannot win the fight without a mortal fighting alongside them. Once the giants are gone, Zeus and his 2 brothers divide up the world. Poseidon rules over the sea. Hades takes over the dark mist at the world's end, and Zeus, of course, rules the sky. But you'll notice that there's a lot of common themes that repeat themselves in Greek myth. what we've been looking at right now are sort of succession myths, a story that demonstrates the change of order or the succession of power in the universe. And you've seen how it's moved down from God king to Zeus finally. And we also see that nature and monsters are tamed, and the world being put into order over and over again. We're not sure exactly how Eastern creation stories reached ancient Greece, according to Barry Powell, who's one of the more famous scholars who talks about classical mythology, but we can note the similarities. The best example of the Mesopotamian creation story is a poem called the Enuma Elish, and it's a story told annually as part of a religious ritual that was performed in Mesopotamia. It's a story about a goddess Tiamat who's both life-giving and life-destroying. And it's a story about monstrous females who are associated with water. And we often see this in Greek myth as well. So anything that can be life-giving can be life-destroying, and you often see female monsters depicted as fluid, leaky, and irrational, and male monsters depicted as hypermasculine and hypersexualized. And you see this in our modern popular media as well. For example, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the character the Hulk is just one example of a hyper-violent monster from our modern culture. But it's important to remember that in this myth, like in Greek myth, creation does not come from nothing, but it arises from an indeterminate mass, like chaos. And that newer gods overthrow older gods, which is also a central theme in Greek myth. So here you can see sort of a comparison with other Eastern myths. And again, you know, the actual way in which these myths were transmitted remains a little bit unclear to us. But the Hittites, who came from what is now central Turkey, had a poem, for example, about kingship in heaven. And you can see the comparison here. It's a very similar story. With a primordial god ruling, followed by a sky god who was castrated by his son. And then storm gods overcome sky gods to rule the heavens. And then gods were born from their severed organs. And you can see from the comparative chart the similarities between the gods in the various cultures. And you know, you can think, for example, with Eastern creation stories and Greek myth, what they have in common. Younger generation destroys an older one, primal pairs of gods. And we can learn a great deal from these stories about the civilizations that are older than the Greeks, and in particular, what they thought it meant to be human and how they worshiped their gods. And basically, then you can learn a lot about Greek myth in comparison as well. So, I mean, things to consider would be, you know, how the world was formed in Greek myth. How does this compare to other creation stories that Dr. Avery might have talked about? And, you know, how do the Greeks use folktale elements in these succession stories? And I always like to ask too, you know, do you think we need stories about heroes and monsters in our society? Why or why not? Why do we need monsters? What do they teach us? Why do we need heroes? All right, I'd like to go on to the creation of mortals. Thank you. So that's my second part of my talk. So I'm going to be talking now about the creation of mortals in Greek myth, and what happens when mortals don't behave the way the gods expect them to. So we learn a great deal about the creation of the gods from the Greek author Hesiod, but it's the Roman author Ovid who tells us the story of how Prometheus the Titan came to make human beings. You may recall that Prometheus was the Titan who sided with Zeus against the other Titans in the Titanomachy. Ovid tells us that the first humans were made out of clay and water. We hear a similar story in the Near Eastern tradition about how humans are made from mud or clay as well. Now, Prometheus was a trickster figure in Greek myth. He served the gods the meat of an ox at a banquet, but to Zeus and Zeus only, he wrapped the bones of an oxen in fat. So then Zeus was angered by this trick and punished Prometheus by taking fire away from mortals. So that the mortals would not starve to death because they were used to cooking their food with fire, Prometheus stole the fire and gave it back to them. Now, Zeus was so angry at this, he decided he wanted to punish Prometheus. Zeus's punishment for this act was to chain Prometheus to a pillar, and every day an eagle would come and peck away at his liver. Since Prometheus is immortal, he cannot die. So every day, he's forced to repeat the same act over and over again as his liver goes back every night, and the eagle comes back and pecks away at it. until Hercules finally frees him from his torment. Among the many gifts Prometheus gives mortal were writing, woodworking, how to raise animals, and brickmaking. He taught them survival skills, basically. Now, when we hear a lot in creation stories in Greek myth about humans, we hear a lot about creation of males, but what about the creation of women? Zeus gifts humankind with a woman named Pandora, or all gifts. He asks Hephaestus, who's the craftsman god, to make the first woman, but she comes with a gift, and it's a jar that's filled with diseases and other evil things. Zeus has Hermes, the messenger god, bring Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's not too bright brother. And Epimetheus was told not to accept any gifts from the gods, but he does so anyway because Pandora is so beautiful. And Pandora opens the jar, and now humans will experience pain, torment, and disease. Only hope remains in the jar when she closes the lid. And this story basically explains marriage and the decline of humans. Why do humans get sick and die? Hesiod tells us in the Works and Days that humankind experiences a decline. He describes the 5 different types of humans and the decline they experience as time passes. They are known as the 5 races of humankind. First came the humans made of gold. They lived like gods, they never aged, and when they died, it was like falling into a beautiful and peaceful sleep. They did not have to work to harvest food either. But the Olympians then made a second group of humans out of silver. They were sometimes violent and did not sacrifice to the gods. So then Zeus made a group of bronze humans who were warlike and violent. They fought one another in war, and when they died, they went to Hades. Then came the 4th group of heroic humans. The heroes fought wars, but they were also described as brave and just. And the final group of humans was made of iron, and they had unending labor and warfare. So as the lives of humans changed, many families found themselves facing changing social hierarchies. So the story of the decline of humankind perhaps reflects Hesiod's own time, which was one of social and economic change. Now, another creation story, and this is a universal creation story across cultures, is the story of the flood. You may be familiar with the story of Noah, who was saved by God because of his goodness when the flood came and wiped out the wicked humans. This is different from Mesopotamian myth, when the god Enlil just wants some peace and quiet and chooses to cut down on the population by creating a flood. The other gods in Mesopotamian myth were horrified at his solution, but one family was saved, just like in the book of Genesis. In Greek myth, the flood comes about when Zeus becomes concerned about the wickedness of humans. Lycaon was one such mortal who was wicked. Zeus disguises himself and goes to visit Lycaon. When he does so, he finds Lycaon practicing cannibalism. He turns him into a wolf due to his wickedness, but then he decides to flood the earth so that he can rid it of humans. When he tells this story to the other gods, however, they protest. They ask Zeus, "Who will worship us if you get rid of all the humans?" He tells them not to worry, he can always make more humans. So Zeus floods the land, but there's one couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are spared. They realize that they're the only humans left and pray to the goddess Themis, who tells them to throw the bones of their mighty mother over their shoulders. Pyrrha recognizes that this means the rocks on the earth as the bones of their mother, and she tells her husband, "Let's start throwing the rocks over our shoulders." And when they do this, a new group of humans is created. Deucalion and Pyrrha have a son, Helen, who gives the name to the Greeks, who are also called Hellenes. In Greek myth, humans came from the earth, much like they did in Mesopotamian myth. And humans differ from gods due to their mortality and the fact that the gods live on Mount Olympus and not on earth. But it's important to remember that no Greek myth tells the story of the origins of the whole human race. Instead, it tells the origins of the Greeks. So the myths told by Ovid and the biblical story of Adam are the stories that explain how all humans came into existence. And again, questions just to consider as you think about this would be the decline of humans in Greek myth. Why might it be necessary for humans to work, grow old, and die? And why is Greek myth often focused on hostile relations between the sexes? And how does Greek myth explain, humans' decline, and what might be common themes in human origin stories across cultures? So now Avery is going to tell you about some creation myths in Norse myth. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Okamic and Sheila Dickinson for inviting us. Very nice, Dr. Dickinson. So we just heard a wonderful sort of summary of creation myth in Greco-Roman mythology, and you're going to see very shortly some of these characters come back in different ways, and some of these themes come back in different ways. Not to say one led to the other, but you're going to see some similarities, and I hope you look for them. Since we're talking about Norse and Germanic mythology, though, we're going to spend a little bit of time about talking about where some of these things came from. It's a little bit where our sources are, what's in them, and for those of you who are interested, where you would go next if you wanted to read about Norse mythology. And again, I'm talking about Norse and Germanic mythology, and this is a rather broad topic, so we're going to narrow it down mostly to the creation story. There will be differences in what we just heard about the Greek and Romans, but you will see old friends again, as I mentioned. So, first of all, I want to talk about where do we get this stuff from? Where did we learn about these myths? And the reason why this is an important question is because there were no pagan writers who wrote extensively their own mythology when we're talking about Norse and Germanic myth. All our sources are going to come from outside. We get classical sources, right? We get our Greeks and Romans writing, but they're not Germanic. They're outsiders. Then we're going to get the Germanic people, the Scandinavian people themselves writing, but they're writing about their forefathers after they've already been Christian for centuries. So we don't have pagan writings, extensive pagan writings by pagans. So this is all other people looking from the outside, and then it's left to scholars to sort of piece together and say, how much of this is Christian influence, what's being taken out, how much of this is, you know, where's the real myth if we can get at it versus what's been imposed on by outside. For our classical sources, we've got a lot of them, but the two main, the ones that are most accessible are going to be Caesar and Tacitus, especially Tacitus, Agricola, and Germania are the more important. And he writes a little bit about customs of the Germanic people and a little bit about what their gods believe. So if you're interested, all this stuff, by the way, easily available online. You can get great editions of Tacitus and Caesar. This is not hard to do. If you're looking for things, I would say that those would be great places to start if you're interested in the classical world. The next thing you're going to get is runes. Now here we get stuff that is actually written by pagans about their own culture. What's the problem with runes? Well, most runes say things like, Stein made this and it's on a sword or something like that. So we don't really get a lot of stories out of them. They're not writing their own myths. Runic script is not ideal for writing long passages. It's ideal for carving into stone and wood and such. What we have up here, right hand, this is a famous little bit of rune that tells the tale of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and we're going to get more about him in a minute. But this little piece, this is, by the way, from Sweden, and we date it, I would say, 10th century. And depicted on it are mythological scenes, and the big one, this is called the Sigurd Stone. Here he is stabbing the dragon, which is the whole thing around here. But the myth in this story is all in these pictures. We don't get the writing. What the writing says is it's a dedication. This stone is found near a bridge, and it was made by a woman named Sigrid. So so the script right here, all that says is Sigrid, mother of Alaric, daughter of Orm, made this bridge for the soul of her husband Holmgar, father of Sigrid. So it's very interesting and it's a dedication, but when we're trying to get mythology, it's really hard to get it out of stuff like that, right? You know, there's not a whole lot there. It is interesting, we're talking about a soul and what does that mean and so on, you know, so these things are, so there, it raises interesting points, but for us, for the scholars, what it does is by looking at the pictures here, we have later sources that we can fill in what this story is about. So that would be our indigenous, or I'm sorry, our actual, what the pagans are writing about themselves. This comes so late, you know, it's a question, did even a pagan write? You know, this is rather late. Runic inscriptions die off by the 1100s, more or less. I mean, maybe you find some here or there, but by then it's all in vernacular, all in Latin. No one's, you know, writing runes anymore. Runic language is a script. I mean, it's not a language, sorry. It's a script, so you find people writing, using runes in Old English, Old Norse, Old Germanic languages. It's a script, not a single language. But for our myths, it's hard to get at the stuff from them. By far, the most important and most accessible and probably the most interesting sources are the Icelandic sources. And these are going to be written, you can call them indigenous in a way. I mean, they're by the people, but they're by descendants of the pagans. So these, let's go to the next one. So these sources are going to be compiled and written by Christians with one possible exception, which is interesting for us, which is poetry. The poetry, because of the nature of poetry, in poetry you have to, the endings have to work, the rhythm has to work. In this kind of poetry, we're going to talk about alliteration, you know, and assonance. That all has to match, so it resists change more than prose does. Certainly more than just simple oral translation. But when you lock something into poetry, you know, you can't change the rhyme, right? Or in this case, you can't change the alliteration, the assonance. So poetry, preserved, however, not, you know, preserved by later Christian writers, is another way into what the pagans might have actually been thinking and writing. So anyway, we have some really good sources. The first one is a Latin source written in medieval Danish by Saxo Grammaticus. And there's someone's rendition of Mr. Saxo. Grammaticus, considered learned, hence Grammaticus has his name. And the next one you're probably familiar with is the Nibelungenlied, which is a German courtly poem. It is the one that Wagner uses for his operas, a lot of the Ring cycle. Then when we talk about Saxo, and I'm going to pitch this a little bit, I highly recommend you read the first 9 books of Saxo, because they are wonderful stories about Danish kings, and they include all these fantastic mythological tidbits. And when we're talking about origins, not only creation origins, but people origins, Saxo does this wonderful thing that a lot of medieval writers do. You know, what do you want to do when you're a king? You want to trace your lineage back to Adam. You know, we're all very familiar with, at this point, things like, what was the, I'm drawing a blank, of course, but what was the name of that Tom Hanks movie where, you know, with the Merovingians and all that, you know, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank, but it's that Tom Hanks movie where, you know, he goes and, you know, he's finding the descendant of Jesus and all that stuff. It was not a great book, but it was very popular. I'm trying, but anyway, what all these people, they're always drawing their lineage back to Adam. And the other thing that, you know, people like to do is legitimize their own culture by looking at ancient culture. So what does Saxo Grammaticus say the origin of the gods are? Saxo writes that they're not really gods. They were powerful wizards and kings from Troy. And they moved north with their people and established their kingdom and became that. So immediately, writing as a Christian, they're not gods, right? That's good. But then legitimizing, like, they too were great. They are inheritors of all the Greek tradition. They are inheritors of all the Roman tradition. They came from Troy, you know, just like everyone else, right? So the other thing that Saxo does that is absolutely fantastic for those of you who are into Shakespeare is this book, Saxo's book, I think it's book 4 and 5, contained the first story of Hamlet. And Hamlet in this is very different than our Shakespearean friend. Hamlet, as you recall from Shakespeare, is a bit of a ditherer. He kind of, you know, he's really conflicted about how he should act and what he should do. And he says he's going to pretend to be insane, but it's a little bit unclear of maybe he really is insane because, you know, what's going on there. Saxo's Hamlet, Amleth, does pretend to be insane, but we absolutely know it's a pretense because the narrator says it. In other words, Saxo says, and now Hamlet put on the pretense of being insane. So it's not Hamlet saying, I'll pretend to be insane, in which case you have an untrustworthy narrator, maybe Hamlet's insane. You know. So we know, I mean, if we're, you know, that it's a pretense. And then the second thing he is not a ditherer. If you like action stories, he goes around and he'll, you know, burn down his enemies' houses. There's a little story of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in there, except this time the messages are on rune sticks instead of letters. And of course, they're wiped out and there's lots of battles, and it's an insane version of Hamlet, believe me. But it's our first treatment of Hamlet. And I believe I don't know how often this is used, but in modern Swedish, Amleth is still a word that used to mean like someone a little bit crazy and stuff like that. But, and then then we have, as briefly mentioned, the Nibelungenlied, and more importantly for what we're talking about is the Volsunga saga. And now we're getting later manuscripts. This is the most recent manuscript. It's the same story as the Nibelungenlied, but now we're reading it in Old Norse as opposed to an Old German language. And the Nibelungenlied tells the story of Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer. Just as this is kind of for fun. Scholars aren't really always too sold on this anymore, but Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, for a while people used to equate the Sigurd the Dragon Slayer story with going back to Tacitus, who writes about 3 Roman legions that are ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest. And some people argue that this was mythologized as a dragon, and that the attacking Germans and their king became, you know, Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. And it's not crazy talk. You have, for example, one of the Latinizations of one of the kings is Arminius, which becomes Herman, which was one of the main characters in the Nibelungenlied, and so on. So there are these little fun things you can do with names, but the whole Dragon Slayer story, I'm just going to go back a slide. So this whole stabbing the dragon could be maybe a reference to a mythologized story of an attack on 3 Roman legions that was done. Now, let's go on to Now we're getting to the real, where we get myths from. And the two most important works for mythology that are left, easily available in English, are the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And the Prose Edda was compiled and written in Old Icelandic by Snorri Sturluson. We have a single author for this whole work. This whole work. And Snorri is by far the most important, well, I shouldn't say by, but the most important writer in Old Icelandic. Not only did he write the Prose Edda, but he wrote numerous sagas, very good stuff. But the Prose Edda was compiled in the early 1200s, so this means that it's not much older than the Divine Comedy from Dante, Marco Polo's Travels. This is the kind of period we're talking about when we finally get this stuff written down. So we're talking centuries of Christianization already, at least, at least 2 centuries in the case of Iceland. The Poetic Edda is compiled in the 13th century, even later, in a manuscript known as the Codex Regius, and some of our slides are going to be from the Codex Regius. And even though it's later, people presume the stories are older again because of the way poetry works and locks in stories, because you can't change the poetry. These 2 books cover the same myths, they cover the same stories, a lot of them, but there's some differences between the 2, just like you can have different versions of myth. These variations, some of them are lost, most of them are not important. And so when I'm about to talk about the creation story, I'm going to draw from both the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, kind of blend and mix and match, because these are the 2 sources. By the way, if you're interested in this stuff, what a blessing to have 2 sources to look at compared to other fields where the sources are endless and never, you can never stop reading. And here we go. If you read these 2 books, you're pretty good. So, so let's get on to what the creation myth is according to the Eddas, written again several hundred years after paganism. So the creation in Norse mythology, there was fire, ice, and the yawning void in between. Muspelheim, the world destroyer, the fire giant's home. Niflheim, the mist world, and in between the Gunganagap, the magic void. From the mist world, a river flowed into the void and froze. The icy frost grew across the void until the fire and ice met, and from their water drops condensed and formed the giant Ymir. So Ymir is our first being, formed out of fire, ice, and the void. So Ymir probably means twin or twofold, because Ymir was both male and female. However, in folk etymology, it meant, people used to think he meant screamer. Well, why would that be? I mean, why would it mean? The words for giants in these languages tend to be words that focus on the kind of things that cause suffering. So one word for giant is risar, and it means like thirst. And Jotun means eater. And for those of you who like Old English, Grendel meant grinder, these kind of, so it's not crazy that someone, if there was a word that sounded like scream, and you heard Ymir and it sounded the same, that you would think the giant's name was Screamer. But it probably meant like twin or something like that because of his both being male and female. From Ymir's sweat, another kind of sweat story, and from his armpits and legs, more giants were born. Next, this ice continues to melt. So we kind of had Ymir came out of the ice, and next came Audhumla. Audhumla is our ice cow. Audhumla, whose milk nourished Ymir. Now, Audhumla, in turn, is nourished by licking the salty ice, the rime frost. And Audhumla keeps licking and licking and licking for 3 days until she uncovered Buri. And Buri is our first god. There she is licking Buri from the ice right there. So now we have Ymir, a cow, and Buri. Buri had a son, Bor, and we don't know who the mother is. Unfortunately, and you see this over and over again in myth, you get like one half of the lineage and not the other. But Buri had a son, Bor. Bor married a giant named Bestla. Bestla and Bor had 3 sons. So now we're kind of a couple generations down, and these names will start to be familiar. The sons were the Aesir, Odin, Vili, and Ve. The Aesir and the Vanir, the gods of the Norse myths, we're only going to talk about the Aesir here, because they're Odin being the most important one for the creation story. The word Aesir itself survives in place names as the prefix os, which is the singular. You might have heard of Osgard or Asgard, just means God yard, the yard of the gods. Odin, Vili, and Ve are our 3 first sort of gods that most people are familiar with, at least Odin. So what do Odin, Vili, and Ve do? Well, they do what most gods do, even though they're part giant themselves. They go and kill the giant Ymir. And from Ymir, they create the world. From his bones, rocks. From his blood, rivers, seas, oceans. From his skull, the sky. 4 dwarves kind of hold up the skull, and that's the sky above our world. And with his eyelashes, they build a big wall, a fortification against the other giants, Midgard. And Midgard, for Tolkien fans, translates into English as Middle Earth. But we haven't gotten people yet. We have to rectify that. So Odin, Vili, and Ve find a piece of driftwood along the shore, and from it they make the first people, Ask and Embla. They give them breath, intelligence, and speech. And Midgard becomes their home. Ask just tends to mean ash, and Embla could mean vine or maybe elm or something like that. And all people come from Ask and Embla. As for the 3 creator gods, they kind of disappear except for Odin. Odin, as highest of the high, remains relevant in our story. So who is this Odin guy? Odin is the god of many things. Odin is the All-Father, the most powerful deity, god of war, not the only one. You're Scandinavian, you need a lot of war gods, but he's god of war, death, secret knowledge, magic. So in late antiquity, he gets equated not with, you might think Zeus or something like that, because he's the most important god. He gets equated with Mercury for hermetic and secret and magic knowledge. And that's why Italian, you have Mercoledì for Wednesday, but we have Woden's Day, Odin's Day, Wednesday, right? Because these two gods got equated with each other later, much later. Odin gained knowledge of magical runes. Odin hung himself from a tree, and we're going to get to this tree in a minute, possibly Yggdrasil. So he sacrificed himself for himself to get knowledge for himself. He tore out his own eye in exchange for a drink from Mimir's well. Mimir's a giant who guards this well, and anyone who drinks from it gets wisdom. So Odin is a kind of, he rips himself apart to gain sort of secret and hidden knowledge, usually prophetic knowledge about the future. Odin has an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir and 2 ravens, Hugina and Mugen, which that means thought and memory. So again, everything about Odin is kind of about the mind and the hidden things and secret things. The other big thing we're going to get here in the beginning of creation is the world tree. Trees don't only factor in the creation of human beings, the very cosmos is envisioned as being connected by or being made from a great ash tree named Yggdrasil. The tree spans all 9 worlds, of which Asgard and Midgard are but 2. The others, we can extrapolate them, and they include a realm of the dead, a home of the giants, home of elves, Muspelheim, the aforementioned Muspelheim and Niflheim from the creation story. Yggdrasil is the holiest place where gods hold court. However, all is not well in our created new world tree. It is beset by rot, by deer, giant deer that eat its leaves and foliage, and a dragon named Nidhogr. And as Odin says, the tree suffers more pain than men know. So what is Yggdrasil? And where did it come from? Unless the tree was included as part of Ymir's body, it must have been another primordial thing. We don't have a text that makes that clear. And even the name is contentious. Some people say it means Odin's horse, which in turn is another name for a gallows tree. Well, how does that work? Odin, as I mentioned before, hung himself for knowledge. And Ygr is a poetic name for Odin, which means terror. And Odin hung himself from a tree to gain knowledge. In poetry, a gallows can be called the horse of the hanged, because a person who's hanged is sort of riding the gallows like a horse. So Yggdrasil, somewhat tortured and very controversial, could mean Odin's horse or the world gallows or something like that. Might also, but it could also simply mean, less poetically, yew pillar, which matches things with, we've had ash and embla and so on, and why not yew too? So a yew pillar. But all these different names depend on what is meant by Ig and Brazil. So sacred groves and trees become very important in Germanic stories, and you get anything that's got an old or interesting tree becomes a grove where people worship. So that's kind of the end of the creation story. We have all our worlds, we have our people, we have our giants and stuff, but really quickly I'd like to mention the end of everything, Ragnarok. Before we go, before we take questions, I'd like to say that why would I bring up Ragnarok? Well, in Norse myth, the gods are mortal and they kill one another at the end, and all the giants get together with all the monsters, and all the gods get on one side and they hash it out, and that's a whole talk in its own right. But for us, what's important is that the long chain of events what's important here is that at the end, Surtur, the fire giant, burns the earth and the heavens, just wipes them out with fire as opposed to a flood. We're just going to get burned out. How does Ragnarok come about? And how it comes about will help explain why I'm bringing it up in a creation story. Ragnarok doesn't technically start, but the long chain of events that lead to Ragnarok starts when Balder, second son of Odin, gets killed. So Balder is described as the best of all gods. And one day he starts dreaming of his own death. So he goes to his mother Frigg, who decides to protect him by making everything in all the realms swear they will not harm him. It's kind of like an Achilles story, right? You know, so you're like, and everything makes this vow, except mistletoe. And maybe she forgot to ask mistletoe, because who cares about mistletoe? And some mistletoe is a little more active and says, I'm not going to do it. But Loki, our trickster god, finds this out, and he makes a spear and arrow out of mistletoe. Now, because the gods because Balder is invulnerable, gods like throwing things at him, rocks, stuff like that, you know, as gods do for fun. And Loki, and what's even more fun is that Balder has a brother who's blind named Hod. And what could be better than having the blind guy throw stuff at like the person who's invulnerable? This is the sense of humor that the gods had. And so Loki sneaks up to Hod and says, hey, why don't you hit him with this? And of course, it's the mistletoe. And here we have Loki leading. Here's Hod, he's blind because his eye is closed. And Loki's kind of whispering in and leading him in to stab Balder. Balder is killed. And this triggers a chain of events. Angered, Odin doesn't kill Hod himself because it's his own kid, but Odin decides to have a child with another goddess or giant, Rindr, named Vali, and this child grows up within 24 hours, and the first thing he does after being adult is get revenge and kill Hod. Then the goddess of the underworld promises to release Balder from the underworld if all the creation will weep for him. And everything, once again, everything weeps for him except for one giantess, Thok, who's said to be Loki in disguise. So Loki, they figured he orchestrated all of this in a very Promethean-like way. They bind him in the underworld. They they bind him to 3 stones, tear open his guts, and they bind him with the intestines of his own son. They drip poison into his face periodically, and whenever it lands on him, Loki writhes in pain, and that causes our earthquakes. But it's a sort of a similar, like it's a Promethean, you know, the god bound being tortured and causing trouble. Now, why does this all lead to Ragnarok? We're not going to get to Ragnarok proper, but basically Loki is going to escape, and all these things are going to happen. And because everybody is angry at everyone else and these revenge cycles happen, we have our big battle, and everything gets burned in the end by Surt. So why talk about Ragnarok for the lecture on creation? Norse myth might be cyclical. There is an after Ragnarok, where the sons of Thor and Odin and the 2 dead gods Balder and Hod return. There is a new creation, excuse me, and new people, and 2 people who survived Ragnarok repopulate the world, sort of a post-flood, but instead of post-fire story. 2 people repopulate the world, and then, but after that, there may even be a new destruction, because the final cryptic words of the poetic Edda, and it's unclear the way it's written if this is a post-Ragnarok thing. It says, the dragon Nidhugr, that's our dragon that's gnawing at the world tree, returns. And that's the end. So, so we might be in a cyclical myth here where things are constantly being created and destroyed. And on that note, as the end and also the beginning, we'd be happy to take some questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to both Jennifer and Avery. You've given us a lot of food for thought about the differences and similarities across cultures of the creation myths. I particularly find the similarities intriguing, and you whetted my appetite for knowing more about Norse myths. I want to mention that if you like mythology in the winter semester, Nancy Dixon's going to be doing a series on Celtic myths, so keep an eye out for that. So, questions? I will bring around the microphone.
Thank you.
Was the book that Avery was trying to remember, the Da Vinci Code?
Yeah. Someone just. Yes, thank you.
And were the descendants of the people who wrote these myths now writing Marvel comics?
Maybe. If you, just thanks for that. One thing I'd like to mention. I'm not sure if this one. Oh, there we go. I got to stick it in my face. This one. The one thing, if there's a lot of books on Norse myth out there, some are very good. I love the author Neil Gaiman. He's got one. But if you're just going to read one book, you can just actually read the myths. You can just get the Edda, and this is the prose Edda as opposed to the poetic Edda, and it's not that long. And you read this, and you maybe know like 70-80%. Getting that last 20%, that's where you got to read and a lot. But if you just this is one place will help you if you're interested in Norse myth. Just get an Edda.
Other questions? So that's EDDA?
Yes.
The prose Edda
Prose,
and
there's,
the poetic Edda.
Yeah, and both are readily available. I think the prose Edda reads better in English because it is prose translated to prose. We always get a problem when we're translating poetry to poetry. An aesthetic thing. If you're just interested in the knowledge, it'll be there.
Right.
But
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm just pleased that the classics department, in this series, we had 1/3 of the faculty from the classics department. Marianne, of course, Jennifer and Avery, and over the years, in fact, we've had half of the classics departments present. Last year, I believe, Tom and Costas each did talk. So thank you very much.